Hello, this is Robinson Erhardt here with the introduction to the August 2024 Ask Me Anything edition of Robinson's podcast. This AMA is supported by the members of the Patreon, a link to which is in the description. So, first of all, thank you very much for all of your support. Some things to mention: I really enjoyed answering all of these questions. Follow-up questions are welcomed for the September edition of the AMA. Now, finally, for the standard disclaimer, I have answered these questions extemporaneously, so I apologize in advance for mistakes and incoherences. So don't quote me, but without any further ado, I hope that you enjoy this AMA as much as I enjoyed answering your questions. To get us started, Mark Slight asks, can you explain Justin Clarke-Doan's separation between what one ought to do and what to do to a lowly geeseling who hasn't studied math, ethics, or logic? First off, I would just dispute the very possibility that there could be such a thing as a lowly geeseling, but I will leave it at that and launch into the question. When I first read the question, I realized, I must have read about this at some point or heard about it at some point. I know that I haven't talked to Justin about it, but my mind still jumped to conclusions. And what I thought that this idea, this distinction between what one ought to do and what to do must have meant was that there is maybe a gap between what one ought, morally speaking, to do and then what one ultimately would do. So maybe another way of putting this is that morality doesn't exhaust all of the things that you need to consider before you, or that one considers before making a distinction. So certainly, maybe not certainly, but I ought to eat tofu instead of steak on a utilitarian reading because eating steak possibly contributes to more net suffering in the world. But beyond what I ought morally to do, what if I really love steak and I think it's healthier than tofu? These things might also weigh in on my decision. So, what I morally ought to do in this case doesn't just completely settle the question of what to do. And at first, this does seem maybe like what Justin meant with this distinction. So I pulled up more his book, Mathematics and Morality, and there's a quote on page 166 that I have. The problem is that moral facts, even if there are any, would seem not to settle the practical question of what to do. And as I just mentioned, it sort of seems like this might thus mean what I had in mind, but it doesn't. But to get at what he means, first we have to introduce a notion of pluralism, more particularly moral pluralism. And the idea here, quite roughly, is that there are multiple consistent moral theories with their own sets of moral facts. And we can illustrate this with a thought experiment on the classic trolley thought experiment. So imagine that you have a trolley going down a set of tracks, speeding toward 5 people, and you have the option of pushing a person in front of the tracks because they are so large that they will stop the trolley and kill the 5 people. And a utilitarian theory, quite simply, might say that to maximize pleasure and minimize suffering, you ought to push the one person in front of the trolley to kill the one person and save the 5. But another alternative theory, a Kantian deontological or rule-based theory, might hold that under no circumstances are you permitted to use a person as a means to an end. So you ought not to push the person in front of the trolley because you are using them as a means to an end. So in this case, we have 2 moral theories. And a pluralist might hold that these two theories are both equally acceptable, valid. They have their own sets of moral facts. And this pluralism poses a problem of what to do. I have a second passage pulled up. Granted that we ought one to kill the one, so this is we ought to kill them on a utilitarian conception, ought two not to, so maybe on a Kantian conception, and so on for any ought like notions you like. So ought notions relative to any number of moral theories. The practical question of whether to kill the one remains open. The different ought-like notions point in different directions, leaving us with the practical question of which of them to follow. Skipping a little bit, practical questions may remain open when the facts, including the moral facts, are settled. So the idea here is that knowing all of the ought facts, so if you knew the ought facts of what you ought to do in all of these different moral theories, it doesn't tell us what we actually ought to do, because picking which one seems to be left open by all the ought facts. And I ought also to mention that there are a lot more bells and whistles to this. Justin doesn't seem to think it relies on moral pluralism, but this is the gist of the argument, that even if we know all of the moral facts, it still leaves open just what to do. And then Mark asks, do you agree that this is a meaningful separation? If you disagree, I hope this is not one of the questions you cannot answer if you wish to be employed someday. This is not one of those questions. Those are questions that are probably more political or religious or something in nature. But based on the passage I just read, I agree that under this assumption of moral pluralism, that there are numerous equally consistent moral theories, there remains this practical problem about whether or not to kill the one person on the tracks that isn't answered by an appeal to the respective theories' moral facts, because on the surface they're on a par, but they suggest taking different actions. Okay, thank you, Mark. Okay, Robbie P says, I get the impression that you have a very disciplined way of life. Would you talk about that a bit? I will happily, or maybe not happily, but I will concede that conventionally speaking, I do live a very disciplined way of life, though lately it has been challenged and challenging for any number of reasons. But the main reason is the podcast, which I like to think of as just a little side project, has been taking an immense amount of time, not only because of traveling and in-person setup and this sort of thing that comes with doing these in-person interviews, but the editing with the multiple cameras is just an absolute ton of work. But yeah, in general, I will concede that I am a disciplined person. Maybe I should say a bit about what my typical day looks like. Though, granted, my typical day, there is no such thing as a typical day, because I have to go to classes or teach classes or record podcasts or these sorts of things. But ideally, I get up, I immediately go out with Mishka, the Vishla, who's in the bed right now, for 2 hours. I put on a backpack that weighs 100 pounds, and I then, well, the backpack doesn't weigh 100 pounds. It's a backpack that is plate loaded, so I could put weight plates on it that you might put on a barbell. And I go out for 2 hours. I use this time to read and do other work. Then I will come home, I will eat, I will drum for half an hour. Then I might write 5,000 words, ideally, of fiction, which I think comes out to about 20 pages. Then at the moment, there are 3 1-hour philosophy work segments. The first of which involves drafting, so writing a paper, and then I have some secondary and tertiary tasks for the second and third hour. Then ideally there's an hour of work on the podcast and no more, but at the moment, unfortunately, there's a lot more work than an hour on the podcast. Just setting this up took 2 hours as I'm fidgeting with all the cameras and trying to get things figured out. And then after that, I would go to the gym for an hour and a half. And ideally, I would probably rather work than do anything else after that. But sometimes I have other things I need to do, like hang out with friends or talk to people or so forth and so on. But that's what my ideal day looks like, and it is quite regimented. So maybe that does make it qualify as disciplined. So how then? Well, the next question is, how did you develop your daily habits, especially when it comes to writing? And the simple answer to that is I developed these habits little by little and inch by inch. So, since you asked, particularly with regard to writing, I mean, there have been periods of time where I haven't been able to write at all. So then I do have to build the habit back up because I can't just go from not writing at all to writing 20 pages a day. There were times in my life where I was writing 60 pages a day, and that would take, I don't know, like 6 to 8 hours. I don't know. I don't even remember how long it took, but it took a long time. So I might start by writing 100 words a day every day, and then move up to 500, and then move up to 1,000, and so on. But it's really an inch by inch thing until, let's say, 100 words becomes a habit, and then it's no longer super stressful or difficult. It just comes naturally. So, for instance, going to the gym is something that I do not have to question at all, or rucking in the morning. These are just quite natural things for me that I don't have to think about at all. I'm not recommending this book, but there's a book that was given to me a long time ago, maybe 10 years ago, probably more, called Choose Yourself by somebody named James Altucher. I have not consumed any of this guy's content since this book, but there was one nugget within this book that I have found extremely useful and is really a vital part of my life, the rest of the book aside. And it's this idea of a daily practice. So I have a list of things that 7 days a week I do. And I used to be extremely obsessive compulsive about this. I have been working very hard on being more flexible. But for instance, 8 years ago, maybe I would have write 15,000 words a day on my list. And if I knew that I could not do it the next day because, let's say, I don't know what I'm going to be in surgery all day. Not that that happened. I would stay up all night to do those words just because I was so compulsive about it. So anyway, I have a daily practice and have for years and years where 7 days a week I do the same things, and these things compound and they just kind of become easy since they're just habitual. Do you have, Robbie P also asks, do you have any recommendations for freeing up time or mental energy? Two things come to mind immediately. One is, and again, I have to make exceptions to this that I don't want to make, but every night when I go to bed, I put my phone on airplane mode. And then the next day, I do not turn it off of airplane mode until I have finished all of my work. And then I consider myself sort of free to talk to friends or make other plans or do other things. It got to the point where, because I'm somewhat neurotic and I guess strange, I had two phones, So my main phone would be off during the day, but I had a secondary phone that was just a flip phone so that my mom or sister could call me if they needed me, but only if they absolutely needed me for something. So I think that's the number one tip, is getting used to having your phone in airplane mode most of the day, though most people can't do that. So there are features on the iPhone where you can only allow certain notifications to pop up. And maybe you might have it so that you only have work notifications during the day. The other thing is, and I'm not a productivity guru by any stretch of the term, but this 80-20 rule, which I have no idea if it's scientific at all, but the idea is that 20% of your endeavors yield 80% of the results. I think it's also known as the Pareto principle, because an economist, if this is true, by the name of Pareto, discovered that 20% of the pea pods in his garden were responsible for 80% of the peas that the garden produced. And one way, I suppose, of freeing up time would be to ruthlessly look at what it is you're spending your time doing and try to call or minimize the 80% of your time that's not really producing results. So for me, that might mean, with regard to podcasting, I could easily spend so much time researching for the podcasts, but ultimately, what matters most is just putting a podcast out. So this might be terrible, but I really have minimized all preparation for podcasts. So for many podcasts, I don't prepare really at all beforehand. For the AMA, I for this AMA, I mean, I printed out the questions, and in doing so, had to look at them. But I could have prepared essays for each one. I did not do that. Maybe you would prefer it if I did that, but this frees up time and mental energy for other tasks. Okay, shifting gears, but also from Robbie P. Do you have much interest in visual art? If so, who are some of your favorite artists, and what are some aspects of art you are most interested in? The answer to this is, I have lots and lots of interest in visual art. Before I decided on philosophy, I was considering doing art history. For a long time, I had an, I don't know, maybe a long time is an exaggeration, but I had an art history and theory blog, and was spending a lot of time reading and thinking about that. But I nonetheless, I mean, so who are some of my favorite artists? I nonetheless have relatively basic tastes. So Rene Magritte is easily my favorite artist, followed just off the top of my head by Salvador Dali and Edvard Munch. And what are some aspects of art you are most interested in? Naturally, I would say I am interested in beauty, though maybe it's not natural. Some people aren't interested in beautiful art. And maybe Rene Magritte, Munch, and Salvador Dali aren't making the most beautiful art. But if I go to a museum like the Art Institute, I am certainly going to be spending a lot of time looking at haystacks, I guess is what comes to mind. I'm also quite interested in how the art makes me feel. So, one of the reasons that I love Magritte's art so much is that it inspires a lot of awe and confusion, and I have to think about things. Or maybe I mentioned this in an episode or the last AMA, but Edvard Munch has a self portrait that, when I saw as a teenager, really resonated with me deeply, and I felt understood and not alone. I'm also interested, though, in technique and how that has changed and changes over time. So for a while, I was very interested in Jackson Pollock's paintings because of how much or the extent to which they constituted a break from techniques in the past. I also find art to be very inspiring for fiction, particularly flash fiction. So I've probably written well, maybe not hundreds, but at least certainly tens of stories that are inspired by Magritte paintings or Dali paintings or things like that. I'm also interested in the history, so developments of technique or developments of theory. Okay, is this the last Robbie P question? It is not the last Robbie P question, but another Robbie P question. Do you have much interest in philosophy as it relates to daily living / coping strategies for life? I'm thinking of things sometimes called spiritual or poetic, but which do not conflict with naturalism. That's good. Like Alan Watts, Robert Wright, or even Rumi might have written about, that what we call work is really play, the Buddhist idea of no self, a sense of poetic communion with the entire universe, or other things like that. My inclination is really just to say no, because I spend pretty much no time thinking about philosophy as it relates to daily life and coping strategies. But I do spend a lot of time thinking about philosophy and how it relates to my daily life. For instance, I spent way too much time yesterday reading about the nervous systems of pinned shrimp, because apparently most of the shrimp we eat belong to this class of shrimp called pinnids, and I was trying to figure out whether or not I have good grounds for believing them to be conscious. So then I was also thinking a lot about animal consciousness. And so I mean, I'm always thinking about philosophy or philosophical topics as they relate to my daily life, but I never am reading about philosophers whose work is philosophers of the sort that you mentioned. But one exception is I do often think about Ayn Rand's book The Fountainhead, and I am not uh, or I don't consider myself to be a Randian libertarian or anything like that, but The Fountainhead was certainly a very important book to me that I read as a teenager. And I still deeply resonate with the protagonist, Howard Rourke. And I guess Ayn Rand was a philosopher of some sort and had a philosophy called objectivism, but I think it's just the values of this literary character that I find fascinating, that I find compelling, and that sometimes I look to for advice about what to do, maybe in a virtue ethics sort of thing, sort of sense. Okay, last Robbie P question. Thank you for all these questions, Robbie P. Please keep them coming. Where do you fall on the planner pantser spectrum? For those of you who are not familiar with planners and pantsers, I usually hear plotters and pantsers, but this relates to fiction, though I think it could also relate to philosophy or nonfiction or any other sort of writing as well. But plotters, in great detail, plot out or plan out what they're going to write in advance of writing, whereas pantsers sort of go by the seats of their pants. That's where the terms come from. And in general, I'm just going to focus on fiction. It really depends on the length of the work. So if I'm writing, which I haven't done for a long time, flash, what's often referred to as flash fiction, so fiction that is, let's just say, less than 1,000 words, so it's not really quite a full length short story, then I'm often just free associating in the first draft, or maybe I have a little kernel of an idea and I'm writing. So a lot of, as I think I just mentioned, Magritte stories or Magritte paintings inspired flash fiction stories. maybe, yeah. And then, but if the project is of any serious length, so let's say a big fantasy series that might be millions of words, then I am doing a lot of plotting, but also a lot of pantsing. So in the back of my mind, I'm always thinking about the big picture, and I'm sure I'm thinking about the big picture while I'm asleep and while I'm showering and all sorts of things. And I will make copious outlines. Right now, every 50,000 words or so, I do a free write and I do a rough plot of what I expect the next 50,000 words to look like. But on a page by page level or even a chapter level, my plotting and planning is quite minimal for a few reasons. I don't know where I first heard this, but an author wrote about or said something to this effect that if they planned too much, they could get into situations where it felt like they were cornering their characters, and their characters who develop lives of their own don't want to follow the plan, and it just becomes very unnatural for them to follow the plan that you have laid out for them. And this is something that I've experienced, so I try not to overly plan too much. But another thing is that as you're writing, ideas will pop into your mind, and they may be really good and really unexpected ideas. And I want to leave some wiggle room for these natural developments to occur. Joyce Carol Oates, who's a friend now and who's been on the show a couple of times, she has her books totally plotted out before she writes them. And she said that if you don't do this, it results in tons of unmanageable editing. I really like the editing process. I think the editing process, and I don't think she would dispute this, but I think the editing process is vital to creating a really coherent piece of work. So as I'm writing, to counteract the fact that I am not just following an outline to a T and there might be unexpected developments, I'm also taking in separate files and locations very copious notes about things that need to be changed. I hope that that answers your question. All right. Next question from the Vicky Falcon. I like that name, even though I'm not sure what it means, though maybe I should know what it means. And the Vicky Falcon says slash asks, I enjoyed watching the AMA today, but was surprised nobody asked the following question, since it's usually a standard one. Which is your favorite interpretation of quantum mechanics, if you have one? Or better yet, to get more insight, how would you rank the interpretations of quantum mechanics? Okay, this is a very big question that requires me to make a couple of hedges. First off, I'm not a physicist, even if I interview a lot of very accomplished physicists and philosophers of physics. So this answer is going to be superficial, and you also ought to take it with a bowl or a shaker of salt, not just a grain, but a shaker of salt. Also, quantum mechanics isn't even a final, so it's not a final theory because it doesn't incorporate gravity, but it's not even a final theory of the quantum because the standard model, which is built on quantum field theory, moves beyond the bare bones quantum mechanical framework. So I think that, I guess, in some sense, while quantum mechanics is clearly very much onto something, it's wrong or at best incomplete. And I think that's another hedge to keep in mind. But toward actually answering the question, I recently spoke again with David Albert. I interviewed him in person when I visited New York City a couple of weeks, which was wonderful. And that episode will be coming out in a week or two. We just discussed exclusively the measurement problem from a more pedagogical direction. And building off of something David says that you will hear, he considers there to be currently 3 viable candidates, 3 good theories, because he and Tim Monlin prefer to think of these as theories of quantum mechanics rather than interpretations. So they think that there are 3 viable candidates currently, and I guess I'll just first list them in order of my least to most favorite, and that would be Everettian, or the Everettian theory, the many worlds theory, then the spontaneous collapse theories, of which GRW, or Gerard Romini Weber, is most famous, and then there are the hidden variables theories, of which Bohmian mechanics is most famous. Then why do I rank them in this way? One, again, keeping that in mind that I'm not a physicist, and the way that I think about this is probably not the way that a serious physicist thinks about this. Is I just find the many worlds brand of the multiverse to be very distasteful, and it involves this huge, very bizarre, not intuitive for me ontology. So I don't like that. I also gather that there are some very serious problems with making sense of probability. I spoke about this with Sean Carroll and David Albert in the episode that we did together. If you want to hear more about this, I do see this as problematic, but it just doesn't cause me this visceral distaste that the many worlds version of the multiverse does. Then the reason that I dislike the spontaneous collapse theories is also just a matter of taste, and it's not really principled, but I just don't like the fundamental stochasticity of spontaneous collapse, so that there's fundamental randomness in the world. I would just like it if the world were deterministic, and that's what brings me to Bohmian mechanics. I like that it is a deterministic theory of quantum mechanics, and then I also like that it seems to tell a story that makes the very mysterious and spooky parts of quantum mechanics, like entanglement or the twin slit experiments. It makes them seem less spooky. And if you want to hear more about that, you should listen to my episodes with Tim Mondlin and Shelley Goldstein, where we talk much more about Bohmian mechanics. So I hope that, again, given my lack of expertise in some areas, this answer was somewhat understandable and worth listening to. Okay, thank you to the Vicky Falcon. And now we have come to Brendan C. Bush, who asked many questions last time. And please, Brendan, ask many more questions. But Brendan says, nice and easy question this time. What is your favorite color and why is it your favorite? My gut reaction is that this is not well, I think the answer comes to mind easily, but the why is it your favorite is not quite as simple. I'm going to go ahead and cheat and say that I have 2 favorite colors, black and red. Maybe black. Maybe it's not cheating, because maybe you would want to dispute that black is a color, but I'm not going to enter into that. So I'm just going to put out black and red. The simplest way of answering why they're my favorite is I just have a visceral like for them. I see black, I see red. I think I like these colors. They're good colors. Whereas when I see yellow, I just despise yellow. I don't like yellow at all. That's my least favorite color, even though you didn't ask about this. But then, if I think about it a bit more deeply, there are associations I make with the colors, or have with the colors, or the colors have connotations that might figure into this visceral attitude I take toward them. So there's tons of terrific literary imagery surrounding black. I mean, darkness, evil, the unknown. Blackness also has this coolness factor, the sleek factor. I guess I'll talk about this later, because there were some fashion questions, but I wore exclusively black for 8 years because I felt like I looked well. There are lots of reasons, but I thought I looked cool in black. Uh, Black looks good, but I'd love a matte black car. I mean, I don't know. Black just looks good. It's got cool things going on. Then red also appeals. Maybe it's again just my lizard brain, hunter instincts, but blood, violence, these are things that I love in movies, in literature. Red connotes intensity. I don't know. I just love red. I love red. I love black. I'm going to put a picture up, or if I remember, I'm going to superimpose a picture here or here of a mask I made in art class as a kid that's red and black and kind of skull like that my dad still has in his house. So I've always liked red and black a lot. Thank you for this question. Okay. Ludwig Johander, or Ludwig Johander, asks, I'm interested in how your background in philosophy intersects with your interest in fantasy fiction. What's your preferred approach to magic in terms of world building, considering aspects such as metaphysics and logic? First of all, this is a topic that I think I could talk about for days, probably not just to a camera, but I would love to talk about these sorts of questions with friends. Well, I worked in a candy store for a few years. I was the manager, assistant manager of a candy store for 3.5 years. And this was when Game of Thrones was still going on. I was reading Game of Thrones. And some of my favorite conversations I've ever had were with my coworker, Ben Hoopus Cook, if anybody knows him and wants to say hi for me. We just would talk for hours and hours about A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones and the magic. And anyway, to answer your question, my background in philosophy doesn't actually connect at all to my thoughts about magic. It does connect to my fiction writing, though, because or questions about, let's say, morality do come up. Morality, morality, free will. These things do come up in my fiction writing. But also, as far as logic goes, I mean, I wouldn't want someone to be able to conjure up a square circle or something like that. That would uh, just, I guess I don't want my magic to involve logical contradictions. But otherwise, metaphysics and logic don't play any role in my fiction writing. Now, okay. Next question is, as a reader, do you prefer narratives that explicate the mechanics of magic or those that maintain an element of mystery and unexplained wonder? I don't think that I have a preference. What matters is that it is done well. And there are examples of both cases. And the two that come to mind are, I'm going to leave. So the Harry Potter series, I think is my favorite series of all time, partially because of nostalgia value. But I also just love reading them. That being said, I don't think that it's the best fantasy series because I think there are some serious flaws in the execution, even though I think J.K. Rowling is a phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal author. But the two examples I'm going to give are the Malazan Book of the Fallen, which is this massive, I would call it advanced fantasy. You need to be a serious fantasy nerd to read this series, but it's probably, there are two authors. They each have their own series and series that butt off of their main series. It's probably, the number of books is in the 20s, I'm sure, and the word count is in probably the 5 to 7 million range. But their the mechanics of their magic are very well thought out and very well explicated. I believe that the series builds off of a series of Dungeons and Dragons games that they actually played together in person. But the way that their magic system works is uh, a long, long time ago, and this is not all of it, of course, but this main god sort of cut open, or he bled out into the cosmos, and his blood and veins created these different sort of realms that have, I guess, a you might think of like a magical charge, like darkness, light, maybe chaos, these sorts of things. Though don't quote me on this. I haven't read these books for years and years, and different people are able to tap into these veins of magic. They're called warrens, and use them to do different things. But anyways, it's very complicated, very well thought out. And what I love about this style of magic is that in a world like this that's so huge, that has so much history, there is just so much to learn. And I always find it funny that I can get so into the world building and reading about magic systems, this sort of thing, in these fantasy worlds, but I'm terrible at actual history. Then, on the other hand, A Song of Ice and Fire, which I think is also absolutely terrific, is much more in the mystery and unexplained wonder camp when it comes to the magic system, because it is not explicated at all. And what I love about it so much is it really, you don't know when magic is going to pop up or what it's going to do, and when it does, it is just absolutely thrilling. So the third book, A Storm of Swords, I still remember there's a scene where I believe it's the Hound. I could be wrong, but his or maybe it's Beric Dondarrion when he's fighting the Hound. But and if you're not an A Song of Ice and Fire fan, this won't really mean much to you. But his sword just ignites on fire for seemingly no reason. And this is it, just like I remember my mind being blown. Like, what just happened? Why did this happen? And so I love that sense of wonder when I get really involved in a world. But there are problems with this too. So for instance, in I believe it's the book two, the end of book two, spoilers, the Red Lady gives birth to like some shadow creature that does a bunch of, or commits a bunch of assassinations, carries out a bunch of assassinations, and it just feels totally at the time, because the world isn't fully fleshed out, as far as it's not really fully fleshed out for the reader. It doesn't feel too overpowered or anything like that, and it was very exciting. But in retrospect, knowing that characters can just do this or things like this, it makes you wonder why it's not happening all of the time in A Song of Ice and Fire. And if it had happened at the so if we had never heard of these shadow assassins until the end of book 7, and these shadow assassins that I don't know, kill Daenerys or something like that, then it would be extremely frustrating that you could just, then it would really seem like a Deus Ex Machina. So you really run the risk of Deus Ex Machinae by pulling these sorts of tricks. But anyway, in sum, I'm a big fan of both sorts of techniques. Okay, then question 3 is, do I have a magic system that is my favorite? And I do want to say Malazan. I love Malazan, and I guess it's just my favorite. I mean, you don't want. I don't even want to say that Game of Thrones, for instance, has a magic system. There is magic, but as far as I'm aware, there's no system. Though maybe Georgie has something in the back of his mind that none of us know about yet. There's also the Kingkiller Chronicle, which has a terrific magic system. Okay, 4, what type of magic system do I prefer in fantasy world building? I'm assuming that you're asking me what I prefer to write, and it's definitely something that is more mysterious and isn't explicated. Part of this is that I'm as a pantser, I like that if I need to, I can rely upon magic to solve problems, but I am very careful not to do it in a deus ex machina sort of way. And this goes back to keeping very copious notes about things that have to be changed in the past. So let's say, just for instance, I have a villain or some creature I don't know how to kill. I will, and then maybe I'm like, okay, the way to do this is with a magic sword. I can't just have written a million words and then a character pulls out a magic sword to kill the final big bad villain. What I have to do is, if I decide upon doing it in this way, I have to go back and in edits either hint that there may be a sword that exists like this, or that such a sword is needed to kill this creature, and then drop little clues here and there. But I like that I have this option if the magic system, if I'm not constrained by a set magic system. But again, then it's very important that you keep things consistent and you don't get overpowered like with these shadow assassins. Thank you, Ludwig. Now, moving on to the one and only Adam Small. There were a number of questions. I'm not picking on you, Adam, but I'm just going to reiterate, perhaps I will be saying this in the introduction, but in general, I prefer more, I don't know, maybe conceptual questions, but maybe you'll consider these to be conceptual questions. But I prefer questions that aren't, how do you solve this physics problem? How do you solve this math problem? How do you solve this logic problem? I think that if you have physicsy questions of these natures, you ought to ask somebody more like Sean Carroll, who's equipped to answer them much better than I am as a physicist. But I'm going to paraphrase your first question because I do think it is a very fascinating question. But again, I'm going to paraphrase it. Assume there are two merging black holes with overlapping event horizons. Assume further that there is a photon in the area of overlap. How will it behave? It seems that it cannot move toward either singularity because it is compelled to move toward the opposite singularity, generating a paradox. What is the solution? Again, I am not a physicist, but I do agree that this is a very fascinating question because facially the idea is that once within the event horizon of a black hole, a particle like a photon must move inexorably toward the singularity that is at the center of that black hole. So, what happens then when you have two singularities where their event horizons overlap as they're merging? And my first response is that the physics of black holes just isn't totally understood. So, this I think is going to hamper anyone who is trying to answer this question. But I imagine, and again, this is not going to be a satisfying answer. I'm more just reading this question because I do think it's fascinating. And the answer that comes to mind, though, is that I imagine that the space time geometry in this region is going to be extremely complex and turbulent, especially because the black holes will be in motion as well, and the photon would be following an extremely complicated path. I can't really say much more than this, but I imagine that the photon is just really following this crazy path as the center of gravity shifts and the two singularities dance around one another. But eventually, the singularities are going to merge, and there will be one singularity, and that's where the photon is going to end up. But this is really all I can say on the topic. It is a fascinating question. Then Adam has a second question. It looks like there's time to sneak one more in. What would the Earth look like if, say, some alien spaceship needed electrons as fuel and went around to planets sucking all the electrons out? What would Earth look like? The mass shouldn't change much since most of the mass is in the nucleus. Can you try to think of all the effects and what would be left? I have a lot of questions about this question. What process are the aliens using for sucking out the electrons? Why are the aliens sucking out the electrons? Do they suck up all the electrons at once? So lots of questions here. Maybe try this one with Sean Carroll as well, but I'm just going to assume that somehow the aliens are just zapping up all of the electrons. They couldn't get electrons elsewhere. They had to do this on Earth. And it's kind of an instantaneous sort of thing. Then, since the Earth would suddenly have an overwhelmingly positive charge, it would basically just explode with all of the positively charged particles repelling one another, and the Earth would no longer exist. I guess that's what would happen. Final question from the one and only Adam Small. I noticed lately a lot of YouTube thumbnails have nuclear explosions, and I saw that on your latest one too. I was wondering what the thought process is of using this image. I do not watch any YouTube channels. I don't watch my own channel, but I believe you that there are lots of thumbnails with nuclear explosions, probably because there are a lot of high profile wars going on and people are talking about a potential World War III, whether or not that is actually, in fact, likely. Now, with Robinson's podcast, I do everything except for one thing. So I do the prep when there is prep. I conduct the interviews. I do all of the editing, the uploading, these sorts of things. The one thing I don't do is make the thumbnails. The thumbnails are made by my BFF, Gramwin Lee. And I suppose that he probably does the thumbnails with nuclear explosions because they're clickbaity. Because unfortunately, in this world with all this competition, I must embarrassingly resort to clickbait in some instances. Thank you, Adam. Okay, Sugarpine Press asks, what sort of humor/comedy tickles your funny bone, and have you ever cast your philosopher's eye on the subject? I have never cast my philosopher's eye on the subject of humor. I like not politically correct, dark, and edgy humor. I think I am probably not particularly politically correct. I am maybe qualify as edgy, possibly even dark in my off podcast speech. But unfortunately, while I wish I could be, I genuinely wish that I could answer any question with total honesty and be perfectly transparent on the podcast, because I don't really feel that I have anything to hide that I'm totally ashamed of. So I would, in principle, answer any question, but for the fact that I do want to be employed. So I can't really speak exactly as I would speak among friends and confidants on the show. But anyway, so that's where my comedy tastes are. I gave up all podcasts. I don't know if I've mentioned this on the show, but not only do I not watch anything on YouTube, but I don't listen to any podcasts. I think the only podcast I've listened to in all of 2024 is Sean Carroll did an episode with Derek Guy of Guy Workwear. And I thought that would be interesting to listen to, and it was, and I listened to it, and I loved it. But the comedy podcasts that I used to listen to that I absolutely loved were Tim Dillon, and then now the Adam Friedland Show, because I love Nick Mullen and I like Adam too, and then Shane Gillis of Matt and Shane's Secret Show or Secret Podcast. But I don't listen to them anymore, but I still think that they're absolutely brilliant. And then my favorite stand-ups right now are Dave Chappelle and Anthony Jeselnik. Okay, Sugar Pine Press has a second, if permitted. Your primary love, you say, is creative writing. Have you reached the point of putting some out into the world that we might sample? I reached that point many, many years ago and have published many, many novels, but they're no longer available because I retracted them. So they're, I guess to answer the question, I have reached that point. I'm not at that point now, and I'm not interested in putting out any fiction for many, many years to come. All right. Aaron Charnay asks, what role does physicality play in your life? Many roles. And maybe I should first answer this question quite literally. And quite literally, there are maybe three things that I do regularly that qualify, four things maybe that qualify as physicality. I'm not going to comment on the last one, but there's rucking, walking, weightlifting, and sex. I will skip the sex part, but what does it do for me? So rucking, as I mentioned a little bit earlier in the episode, I have this pack. I should put up pictures. Maybe I will have already. Maybe I in the future will put up pictures that you will have already seen when I mentioned rucking earlier in the episode. But I every morning I wear this pack. It used to be, I mean, I started with 17 pounds and then moved up to 135 pounds over the course of many years, but that was just unbearably painful and Sisyphean. So I moved down to 100, which is what I'm pretty comfortable with. And I wear this 100-pound pack for 2 hours every morning. I go out. And the reason that I do this is it started with Mishka the Vishla needs to be very active. This gets him 2 hours of off leash time every morning. But it's also, on a physical level, it's good GPP, and that stands for general physical preparedness. It's good cardio. I have a good base in my lower body. I also think it has helped with some leg hypertrophy, which is the technical term for muscle growth. Second, or third, fourth, I don't know what if we're at yet, but at now, I also do my reading when I'm rucking. So this morning, for instance, I was reading about string theoretic dualities from a philosophical perspective, but I will also occasionally read a book to prepare for a podcast. So most recently, I read Leonard Susskind's book, The Cosmic Landscape. Then to round this out, because the list wouldn't be complete without this, I also ruck, and it's not like I consciously think about it in this way, but it is certainly a form of self-punishment that my self-loathing manifests. So I'm unhappy with my life, I guess, or how I've lived my life to this point. I'm unhappy with how I look, with how unintelligent I think I am. I'm unhappy with all these many things. And I think one of the reasons that I'm so disciplined, and in particular, possibly physically abusive, is that I feel I need to suffer for my inadequacies. So that's another role that, or another reason that I ruck. More generally, did I even mention that I lift? Yes, I also lift for an hour or an hour and a half in the evening. Anyway, more generally, in my life, YOLO. Sorry for that. You only live once, and I would like to be the best person I can be. So more specifically, I associate physical strength with masculinity. I would like to be masculine. I also think of it as, I don't know, one dimension of being a person is being physically fit, and so I would like to be as physically fit as I can be. I also very much want to look good. This will come back, I think, maybe as I get to those fashiony questions. But a lot of people look down on people who want to look good. But I think that this is absolutely silly. It's sort of, denying a vital part of being human. We are social animals. We want to attract other people, both, sexually and platonically. And it's just a fact of our culture that people are valued for looking good, and we value ourselves if we look good. So I think there are plenty of very good reasons for wanting to look good, though, of course, this leaves open the question of what it means to look good, who decides what looking good is, and so forth. My working out habits are also just a compulsion that comes from my OCD. It helps to anchor my schedule. It's one way in which I feel that I'm making concrete progress in my life. It's a mental break from working on more demanding tasks. In the past, I've also geeked out on working out in maybe an almost escapist sense, certainly an obsessive sense, but I'm technically a licensed personal trainer, and I have many, or certified personal trainer. I have many other certifications. I've spent a lot of time in gyms, so I have some knowledge of what I'm talking about, but I think that it's it was escapist in the sense that I was avoiding real problems, real things I could do to make myself feel better about myself, and I don't know, transferring my energies elsewhere. And then I can also use, when I'm in the gym, I can use breaks between sets to text and other things, which I don't do during the day. Okay. Thank you for that question, Aaron. Adam Terry asks, do you think consciousness is emergent or fundamental? To answer this question, I think first we should get clear on what emergence and fundamentality are. And it's worth noting that it is extraordinarily difficult to give necessary and sufficient conditions for emergence and fundamentality, or alternatively, to give them airtight definitions. So I'm just going to, there are still plenty of open debates on this. So I'm just going to sketch what they are first, or how we might think of them. One decent criterion for what fundamentality might be is something is fundamental when it doesn't depend on anything else for its existence. So an electron might be a fundamental object, or charge might be a fundamental property. And then, because molecules depend on their component parts, the atoms that comprise them, molecules are not fundamental. And then an emergent thing might depend on its components, like a molecule, or an emergent property might be a property instantiated by a collection of objects that its components don't have. So again, a molecule might be an emergent thing, or water molecules, a vast collection of water molecules might be wet, though an individual water molecule is not wet. And on these loose understandings of what fundamentality and emergence are, I most certainly think that consciousness is emergent. I don't think it is fundamental like charge. I think that highly complex things like chairs or pins in my lap, or in this case, minds, tend to be emergent in that they depend on very large aggregates of fundamental things. I think this is one of the major things we've learned from all of science and the reductionistic a reductive program? Thank you for that question, Adam. Now, Laura Nicole asks, what are your views on fashion? And okay, the way that I would answer this is first, I think, not that the question is bad, but just so that I think it's a really good question and it's a question that I really like, or I'm happy to answer. But I'm going to rephrase it to make it a little bit easier for me to answer. So instead of what are my views on fashion, what are my attitudes toward my own fashion? And quite basically, I would say that any aspect of my life that I can enjoy, whether it's companions like pins or Mishka or food or friends or my furniture, if I can enjoy them, I would really like to enjoy them and select things so that I can enjoy them. So, clothing, since I'm wearing it all day, is no exception. And there are many things that I'm thinking about when it comes to clothing. Perhaps the first category of things might be the aesthetics. I like clothes that are pretty. Maybe you think that this jacket is not pretty or it's gaudy or something, but I really like the way that it looks. I really like the blue color. I like the paint. I like that to me, it's an interesting and a unique garment. I also, I guess, feel is important. And I don't care so much about comfort. This is a dispute I'm often in with my friends. I think comfort is overrated. Comfort is for babies. Maybe this goes back to my rucking, but I do care very much about how fabrics feel and their construction. So I like garments that feel very sturdy and high quality. I'm also very interested in the story of a garment. So I'm quite interested in who constructed it, how it was constructed, the equipment that went into constructing it, the materials that went into constructing it, the people who constructed it. I'm also interested in what the brand or the person might stand for, the history of the type of garment itself. Maybe some examples would be useful. I'm looking at my closet right now. One jacket that I have is a Japanese made reproduction of a World War II bomber jacket. I like that this company is known for their attention to detail in reproductions. So they sourced a bunch of these original jackets. They made their own threads to emulate as perfectly as possible the threads in the original jacket. They purchased dead stock Talon zippers, so zippers that went into making the original jackets 70 years ago. They then, built the jackets to the exact specifications. And I don't know, this is just the sort of thing that I geek out on. I would say that I'm not particularly interested in trends, though maybe something new will emerge that I find attractive or interesting. And I'm also, I guess this goes back to the physicality question. I am very concerned. Maybe this is something that some listeners will think I should be ashamed of, but it's just a fact that I am very concerned with my own appearance. That's not to say that I'm obsessed with, well, maybe I am in some ways obsessed with my appearance, but I don't love my appearance. But I do think about it a lot because I think that, how I look or how I see myself, I have body image issues. It's very important to my sense of self confidence, but how others see me, whether with regard to dating or just friends. I mean, how you dress, how you look, it says a lot about who you are, because whether we think it's appropriate or not, we do judge people. We judge books by their covers because we don't often have the time to get to know somebody before we make decisions about whether or not they're worth getting to know or interesting or what have you. And then there are also just facts that, I mean, men with more square jaws are more likely to be voted into a position of political power. This isn't a comment about my own jaw. It's just to illustrate that human psychology works in such a way that we're very much attuned to how people look. So I just think that these are things worth thinking about and keeping in mind. Laura Nicole's second question is, which styles do I like or dislike? And on other people, I don't really think I care too much about what styles they're wearing so long as it looks good on them. But for me, I tend toward garments with both history and utility. So I like military garments. I like workwear type garments, neither of which, I guess this is probably more of a fashiony garment, but I also like very durable things. You also asked, who are my fashion idols, if I have any? The two people that come to mind when you ask this question are Kanye West. Not that I would ever dress the way that he dresses, though maybe I would in some cases, but I do think of him as the consummate artist, and he is always wearing very interesting and provocative things. The next person that comes to mind is Jacob Elordi. And it's not so much that he's a fashion idol, but I'm 5'10". He is, I think, like 6'5" or 6 foot. I don't know. He's a very tall person, and I'm very jealous of the clothes that he gets to wear. I find that I have to wear clothes that are relatively well fitting, but he gets to wear these very elegant, loose, long, drapey things, which, I mean, he always looks very good and very cool in them. The next question is, how have these views and your overall sense of style evolved over time? My interests in clothes and fashion started in early high school. They definitely stemmed from insecurity, and then insecurity about my appearance and feeling like the girls I liked didn't like me, and then a desire to fit in and be cool. And then I was also extraordinarily stressed out my, let's say, my freshman year of high school, which is when I first started thinking about clothing. So it was also a form of escapism. If I could spend a couple of hours reading blogs about clothing, it would distract me from the other issues that were going on in my life. Eventually, though, this became super obsessive. So I would buy lots of really expensive, cool clothing that I was then way too neurotic and self conscious to wear. And I was spending so much time reading about clothes that it became overwhelming. So, as I mentioned a little earlier, I adopted an all black uniform for 8 years, where I wore the same black T-shirt, the same. Well, I had multiple of these, but same black pants, same black T-shirt, same black shoes every single day. And I only stopped doing this, I think, maybe really just before I started the podcast. And so when I started the podcast, I really just bought a bunch of Uniqlo staples, basically, and have since been figuring out my wardrobe and have gradually donated those initial Uniqlo garments and replaced them with garments that I love. But the general arc has been learning a lot, or it started with knowing nothing, then it became learning a lot about materials and construction and developing an understanding of the brand and manufacturing landscape and coming to understand what looks good on me with regard to colors and fit. Fit is most important, and then that's where I am now. I don't think that I'm a particularly creative or interesting dresser or anything like that. Okay, and then still from Laura Nicole, but a shift in topic. What is it like to be a philosopher? Like, for example, do other people hold you to a higher standard and expect you to act in a more ethical way? One, I do not think of myself as a philosopher. This is terrible, maybe, but to me, this is terrible. Philosopher has a pejorative connotation for me. When I think of philosopher, I think of, maybe this isn't pejorative. This is not pejorative at all. I think of ancient philosophers, people walking around with togas, very much a fan of those people. But then I think of philosopher. When I hear the word philosopher, I think of people, some people, certain people, I'm not going to name, in the continental tradition, who I think are just absolutely spouting gibberish. So I really don't think of myself as a philosopher because I hope that I'm not spouting gibberish. But so my general, what's it like to be a philosopher? How do people react to hearing that I am a philosopher, begrudgingly to use that term? I would actually say it's quite negative, because as far as other people like physicists or mathematicians are concerned, and there are exceptions, we don't have specific tangible skills that are readily observable, and we're often looked down upon as being pedantic and not productive. Many philosophers deserve to be looked upon in this way. I think that most philosophers are not good and they're not useful. But I wouldn't want to do anything other than philosophy in academia. I think that the best philosophers are doing the most important and the best work, and they're answering the best and or the hardest, the most interesting questions. I wouldn't want to do anything else because in other fields you're totally pigeonholed, but in philosophy you can work on, not that many philosophers pigeonhole themselves, but you don't have to. You can work in problems in math and one day, physics the next, mind the next. But what I like about philosophy or being a philosopher is that we can draw on and do other research if we want to. We can work on any sorts of problems that we want to. I think that this answers my question. I don't think people really hold me to a higher ethical standard. Next question from Laura. How do you choose a topic on which to focus your philosophical studies on? There are, I think, a number of different ways that I might choose a topic. One would be I would think about my current interests, which right now, because I'm thinking so much about what I'm eating and what it means to be a good person, I would be interested in questions related to meta ethics or animal consciousness. I mean, that's what I was reading about yesterday. I would also be considering what the market wants. The job market right now probably wants gender related or social slash political philosophy. I have zero interest in doing any of this work, though some of it is interesting. The market also wants metaphysics or the core philosophy. So I also have to keep that in mind. I'm also concerned with what's expedient. I just published a paper that I mentioned in the last article, in the last AMA, on a model theorist named Abraham Robinson's philosophy of mathematics, and in part how it's unsatisfactory. And because I'm an expert on this topic, it's expedient or more easy for me to build on that project and write a follow-up paper. Then there are things that come up in conversation or in reading, such as these issues of, from talking to string theorists, I noticed that a lot of them have, no offense to the string theorists, but I'll say it anyways, very confused understandings of string theoretic dualities. And there's a lot of interesting work to be done on the philosophy of the same. I think that pretty much runs the gamut there. Last question from Laura. What tools and strategies do philosophers currently use to make progress on the open questions within their field? There are, the standard processes, I guess, are just thinking quietly, talking with other philosophers or non-philosophers, reading lots of the extant literature on the topics and engaging with them. And I guess this goes together with the talking with the non-philosophers, but engaging in interdisciplinary projects. So philosophers work with cognitive scientists or physicists or mathematicians. But then you also ask about strategies. I think the main strategy, and it's easier said than done, is to try to think clearly about problems. So that means making relevant distinctions in conceptual space to get at some sort of rigorous, objective subtlety in dealing with these very complex problems that don't have a clear-cut methodology for solving. So as more philosophy is done, we make progress in this conceptual way. Take, for example, a problem that comes to mind is the problem of vagueness, which I will also just illustrate with an example. The ancient Greek philosopher Eubulides, I believe, invented this problem. It's called the Sorites paradox, which comes from, I think, the Greek word for grain, maybe. If you take 1 grain of wheat, it's not a heap. 2, it's not a heap. But clearly 10,000 is a heap. So somewhere between 1 and 10,000, a non-heap becomes a heap. But it seems that if I keep asking you, is 2 a heap, is 3 a heap, is 4 a heap, is 5 a heap, you're always going to say no, because it seems absurd that 1 grain of wheat can make a difference between a non-heap and a heap. So in this sense, this is the problem of vagueness. The predicate or the property heap is vague in that it doesn't seem to carve the world at the joints. And over the years, this problem was reintroduced in the beginning of the 20th century by Bertrand Russell. There have been more and more ways of dealing with the problem. I'm not going to explain them, but some of them have looked at human psychology. So Diane Raffman comes to mind. You might change the logic. You might just say that vagueness is a problem of language. There are all sorts of different strategies. And once they're all on the table and we start to exhaust the possibilities, we can compare them and think about the problem more clearly. And because we have much more information and philosophical tools and conceptual distinctions than the ancient philosophers, we can make much more progress in answering these old and ancient problems. Final question comes from Nicholas Nichetti. And Nicholas says, Suskind was great, but listening to that episode made me more convinced that Lee Smolin is onto something. Lee Smolin's theory of cosmological natural selection has a similar landscape of possibilities to what Suskind is a proponent of, but by attaching it to natural selection, a universe that is stable and can develop complexity becomes a likely thing versus being a 1 in 10 to the 500 outcome. Whatever the mechanism might be, a cosmological natural selection model seems a lot more anthropic than the eternal production of bubble universes that are unable to support life. Since you've spoken to both of them, I'm curious where you stand on this. Okay. To introduce this issue means to introduce the fine-tuning problem. If you look at the standard model of particle physics, which is our best theory of the microscopic, so we're going to leave general relativity out for now, it looks like there are 17 free parameters in our best theory of physics. What that means is that there are 17 constants or components of physics, I guess, that don't just emerge naturally from the theory, but that we had to go out into the world and investigate to discover. And some of these constants are so sensitive that if they were just slightly different, life couldn't have arisen. And this is what leads to the fine tuning problem. We want to explain why it is that the constants are the way that they are when they seemingly could have been very different. The two ideas, broadly construed, that Nicholas is referring to are, at least in part, solutions to, or purported solutions to the fine tuning problem. And I'll start with what these two ideas are. The first, Leonard Susskind, stems from this concept or theoretical construct called the string landscape. Okay, first of all, what string theory is string theory reimagines the point particles of quantum mechanics as tiny vibrating strings, the vibrations of which give rise to what we observe as the fundamental particles of the standard model. And what this is saying, what the string landscape is saying, is that there are 10 to the 500 different possible sets of laws of physics that could emerge from string theory, essentially. And the idea is that new universes are constantly bubbling up with different laws of physics, different, each set of which is plucked from this landscape. And it's motivated not only by string theory, but by cosmological inflation. And then the other idea is cosmological natural selection, which is that any black hole can produce a new universe, and the new universe has slightly different constants from the parent black hole or the parent universe. And this reproduction, the parent universe that the black hole is, that the original black hole is located in, and this reproduction process will result in more universes that produce black holes. And if these happen to coincide with universes more like ours, they'll be more likely to produce universes with constants like ours that could give rise to life. Both ideas have some problems. So, string theory is quite notably not rigorously developed or experimentally confirmed. But string theory is still well motivated theoretically, and most of the world's high energy particle physicists work on it. And then inflation is the dominant model in cosmology. So there is still a lot behind the string theoretic multiverse solution to the fine tuning problem. On the other hand, the cosmological selection model or idea is totally speculative. So I don't know of any good reason to think that black holes spawn new universes, for one. Another problem is that, according to quantum mechanics, information cannot be lost, but if information is transferred to offspring universes through black holes, then there could be information loss, which would contradict our best confirmed theory of physics. So, in short, while the question is very much open, I, contra you, Nicholas, have a much higher credence that the string theoretic cosmological inflation solution is right rather than the cosmological natural selection model. All right. And this completes the August Ask Me Anything episode of Robinson's podcast. And I will have said this in the introduction, but I am extremely thankful for all of your questions. This was very fun, and I am looking forward to September. So please come back and ask more on the Patreon.